Harold Bennett had spent 53 years working the same land. At 72, all he needed was a $5,000 loan to repair the irrigation pump that kept his small farm alive. Instead, the bank manager looked him in the eye and quietly said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Bennett, we can't approve your application." Harold nodded, thanked her anyway, and walked out carrying nothing but a worn envelope and the weight of another impossible season. To everyone else, it was just another old farmer who had run out of luck. 3 days later, while clearing out the bedroom where his late father had once slept, Harold moved an old grandfather clock that hadn't ticked in decades. Behind it, hidden inside the wall, was a small rusted metal box. Inside lay a faded bank passbook. No one in the Bennett family had ever mentioned it. The account had been untouched for more than 40 years. Harold almost threw it away. But when a young bank employee typed the account number into her computer, her smile disappeared. She stared at the screen, stood up without saying a word, and hurried into the manager's office carrying the passbook with both hands. Within minutes, the entire branch had fallen strangely silent, because that forgotten account wasn't supposed to exist anymore, and what it revealed would change far more than one elderly farmer's life. Harold Bennett had always believed that if a man worked hard enough, the land would eventually repay him. For more than 50 years, the rolling fields surrounding his small farmhouse had provided enough to raise a family, pay the bills, and leave a little hope for the next season. But hope had become harder to harvest than corn. 2 dry summers, 1 violent storm, and rising costs had left his 70-acre farm struggling to survive. The irrigation pump had failed again just as planting season approached. Without it, the young crops would never make it through another hot summer. The repair estimate sat folded inside the front pocket of his faded denim jacket. $5,000. It wasn't a fortune. It was simply more money than Harold had. Early Monday morning, he climbed into his aging pickup truck with Rusty, his gray-muzzled dog, watching from the porch. Harold gave the old dog a reassuring pat before driving toward the only bank in town. He had delayed this visit for weeks, hoping to avoid borrowing money, but there were no other options left. Inside the small bank, the familiar smell of polished wood and fresh coffee greeted him. Most of the employees knew Harold by sight. He had banked there for decades. Emily Carter, the young loan officer, welcomed him with a polite smile and invited him into her office. She listened carefully as Harold explained the broken irrigation system, the failed harvest, and his plan to repay the loan after the next season. Emily entered the information into her computer, reviewed several documents, then quietly excused herself for a few minutes. When she returned, her expression had changed. "Mr. Bennett," she said gently, "I'm truly sorry. Based on the bank's lending requirements, we can't approve a $5,000 loan." Harold remained silent for a moment. "Is it because I'm too old?" Emily hesitated before answering honestly. "Your age isn't the only factor. Your recent farm income has declined, and the projected risk is simply too high." Harold nodded slowly. He had expected disappointment, but hearing the words still felt heavier than he had imagined. He gathered his paperwork without argument. Emily stood as he reached the door. "I really am sorry." Harold offered a tired smile. "You're just doing your job." Outside, the afternoon wind carried dust across the nearly empty parking lot. Harold sat behind the steering wheel for several minutes before starting the engine. $5,000 had never seemed so impossible to find. The drive home felt longer than usual. Every passing field reminded him that planting season would not wait for anyone. When he reached the farmhouse, Rusty greeted him with a wagging tail, unaware that the future of the farm had grown even more uncertain. That evening, Harold called his daughter Grace. She answered on the second ring. "How did it go?" she asked. Harold sighed. "They turned me down." Grace was quiet before speaking again. "Dad, maybe it's time to think about selling part of the property. You don't have to carry all this alone anymore." Harold looked through the kitchen window toward the fields his father and grandfather had worked before him. "Not yet," he replied softly. After ending the call, he wandered through the old farmhouse. Dust-covered shelves that hadn't been touched in years. Since his parents had passed away, several rooms had become little more than storage. If selling land became unavoidable, he decided he should first clear out the old family belongings. Perhaps there was something worth selling, an antique, old tools, anything that might buy him another chance. The next morning, Harold carried empty boxes into his late parents' bedroom. Sunlight filtered through faded curtains as he sorted through worn blankets, yellowed photographs, and forgotten keepsakes. Against one wall stood the tall grandfather clock his father had wound every Sunday evening until it stopped decades earlier. Harold smiled faintly at the memory before deciding to move it so he could clean behind it. The heavy clock scraped slowly across the wooden floor as it shifted away from the wall. Harold froze. Behind it, where no one had looked in more than 30 years, was a narrow opening hidden inside the wall itself. Harold knelt beside the narrow opening, brushing away decades of dust with the sleeve of his jacket. The space behind the wall was barely large enough to fit his arm. He reached inside carefully, expecting nothing more than old insulation or forgotten wiring. Instead, his fingers touched cold metal. He pulled out a small rectangular tin box. Its once blue paint faded beneath patches of rust. The lid resisted at first, before giving way with a dry creak. Inside lay several neatly arranged items wrapped in yellowed cloth. The first was a worn bank passbook bearing the faded logo of First County Bank. Beneath it rested 3 unopened envelopes tied together with cotton string and a small brass key no longer than Harold's thumb. Everything looked as though it had been placed there with great care and never touched again. Harold turned the passbook over in his hands. The cover carried only one name: Samuel Bennett. His father's handwriting appeared on the inside cover beside an account number and a date from more than 40 years earlier. Harold frowned. His father had never mentioned another bank account. In fact, Samuel had rarely spoken about money at all. He had always insisted that a good harvest was worth more than a full wallet. Harold opened the passbook. Several deposits filled the early pages, written in careful ink. Then the entries simply stopped. There were no withdrawals, no notes, nothing after the final transaction. "That's strange," Harold murmured. Rusty wandered into the room and sniffed the dusty box before settling quietly beside him. Harold considered opening one of the letters, but hesitated. They were still sealed. Whatever his father had intended, he had clearly wanted them left untouched until someone found the box. Unsure what to do, Harold placed everything back inside, except for the passbook, and carried it downstairs. While making coffee, he found himself staring at the faded cover again and again. The account could have been closed decades ago. There might only be a few forgotten dollars inside. Still, something about the careful way his father had hidden it made Harold reluctant to ignore it. Before noon, he drove to visit Walter Dawson, his father's oldest friend. Walter lived on a neighboring farm a few miles away, though age had long since persuaded him to lease most of his fields. The elderly man welcomed Harold onto the porch with a warm handshake. "You don't usually come by on weekdays," Walter said. "Everything all right?" Harold explained the hidden compartment and placed the passbook on the table between them. Walter's smile disappeared. His weathered face seemed to lose its color as he stared at Samuel Bennett's name. For several long seconds, he said nothing. "Where did you find this?" he finally asked. "Behind the old grandfather clock." Walter slowly removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I wondered if anyone ever would." Harold leaned forward. "Do you know what it is?" Walter looked toward the distant fields before answering. "Your father once told me that if the day ever came when someone found that passbook—" He stopped, choosing his words carefully. "They shouldn't make any decisions alone." "What decisions?" Harold asked. Walter shook his head. "He never explained, only that those papers mattered." "Why didn't he tell me?" Maybe he thought the right time would never come. The answer only deepened Harold's confusion. Walter offered no further explanation, and Harold sensed the old man would say no more. As he prepared to leave, Walter placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Take the passbook to the bank before you do anything else. Don't throw it away. Don't ignore it. Just let them look at it." Harold nodded. The drive back felt different from the one after his rejected loan. Questions now occupied the empty space where disappointment had been. The following morning, he slipped the passbook into the same worn envelope that had carried his failed loan application only a day earlier. He walked through the front doors of First County Bank once again. Emily Carter looked up from her desk and seemed surprised to see him return so soon. Harold offered a polite smile and placed the faded passbook in front of her. "I think I found something that belonged to my father," he said quietly. "Could you tell me if this account still exists?" Emily Carter accepted the faded passbook with both hands, turning it over as if afraid the brittle cover might fall apart. "This belonged to your father?" she asked. Harold nodded. "I found it hidden inside the wall of my parents' old house yesterday." She offered a small smile. "Let's see if our records still recognize it." Harold settled into the chair across from her desk. Unlike the previous day, he felt no expectation. If the account had been closed decades earlier, at least he would know. Emily typed the account number into the bank's computer, her fingers moving confidently across the keyboard. She waited for the search results to appear. Instead, a small message flashed briefly on her screen before disappearing. She frowned. "That's odd." Harold leaned forward. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. At least, I don't think so." She entered the number again, checking each digit carefully against the faded print. The same thing happened. This time, the computer paused longer before displaying another message she had clearly never seen before. Emily's expression changed from curiosity to confusion. She clicked through several menus, trying another search. Again, the system refused to display normal account information. Harold watched her silently. "Has the account been deleted?" he asked. "Usually, even closed accounts leave a standard record," Emily replied quietly. "This isn't responding like one." She stood. "Would you mind waiting a moment?" Before Harold could answer, she picked up the passbook and walked briskly toward a glass office overlooking the lobby. Through the window, Harold saw Thomas Green, the branch manager, reviewing paperwork. Emily knocked once before stepping inside. She handed him the passbook and pointed toward the account number. Thomas barely glanced at it before looking back down. Then his posture stiffened. He took the booklet from her, opened it himself, and adjusted his glasses. Even from across the lobby, Harold noticed the manager's expression grow unusually serious. The two exchanged only a few quiet words before Thomas looked directly toward Harold. A moment later, both of them walked back together. Thomas extended his hand politely. "Mr. Bennett, I'm Thomas Green, the branch manager." Harold shook his hand. "Good morning. Would you mind joining us in my office?" Harold felt a slight knot tighten in his stomach. "Is something wrong?" Thomas answered carefully. "I simply think we'll have more privacy there." The office door closed behind them. Thomas placed the old passbook gently on his desk, almost respectfully. "May I ask exactly where you found this?" "Behind an old grandfather clock in my parents' bedroom. It was hidden inside the wall with a few letters and a small key." Thomas nodded slowly, but asked nothing about the other items. Instead, he opened a secure banking program on his computer and typed the account number himself. Emily stood quietly beside him. Harold noticed both of them watching the screen with unusual concentration. Several seconds passed before Thomas entered an authorization code. Another screen appeared. He read silently, then looked at the passbook again as though comparing two pieces of a puzzle. "Remarkable," he whispered almost to himself. Harold cleared his throat. "Can someone please tell me what's happening?" Thomas folded his hands. "Mr. Bennett, I can tell you one thing immediately." Harold waited. "This account was never closed." Harold blinked. "You're sure?" "Yes." Thomas turned the monitor slightly, but not enough for Harold to read the details. "According to our records, it remains active." Harold struggled to understand. "That can't be right. My father passed away years ago." "I understand," Thomas replied. "That's part of why this is so unusual." Emily looked between the two men, but said nothing. Harold rubbed his weathered hands together. "If it's still active, can you tell me how much is in it?" Thomas hesitated. "Before discussing balances or ownership, I need to verify several historical records. Accounts this old sometimes require additional documentation." Harold's shoulders sank slightly. "So we're back to paperwork." Thomas offered an apologetic smile. "I'm afraid so. But this isn't a routine situation." He stood and walked to a tall filing cabinet at the back of the office. Unlocking the bottom drawer, he removed a thick binder covered in dust. Harold noticed the manager handling it with the same care he had shown the passbook. Thomas laid the binder beside the computer and compared several handwritten entries with the digital record. His brow furrowed deeper with every page he turned. Finally, he looked directly at Harold. "Mr. Bennett," he said quietly, "before we go any further, I need to ask you one more question." "Go ahead." "Is there anyone else in your family who knows this account exists?" Harold thought of Grace, Walter, and the unopened letters resting safely inside the rusted tin box. "No," he answered honestly. "As far as I know, I'm the first person to see it in more than 40 years. Thomas slowly closed the binder. "Then I believe it's very important that we proceed carefully." Harold left the bank carrying more questions than answers. Thomas Green had promised to research the old records and contact him within a few days, but he had offered no explanation beyond confirming that Samuel Bennett's account was still active. During the drive home, Harold kept replaying Walter Dawson's words. "Your father once told me that if the day ever came when someone found that passbook, they shouldn't make any decisions alone." The sentence sounded less like advice and more like an unfinished promise. Rusty greeted him at the porch with the same loyal enthusiasm as always. Harold scratched the old dog's ears before walking back into the farmhouse. The rusted tin box still rested on the kitchen table exactly where he had left it. This time, he picked up the 3 sealed envelopes. The paper had become fragile with age, but the wax seals had already cracked. He carefully opened the first envelope. Inside was a single handwritten letter. It was not addressed to Harold. Instead, it began with the words, "Dear Sam." Harold immediately recognized that the handwriting belonged to someone else. The letter thanked Samuel Bennett for helping a family keep their farm after the terrible drought decades earlier. It spoke of money that had been accepted only because Samuel insisted it was not charity, but a chance to start over. At the bottom, the writer promised that every dollar would one day be returned. Harold stared at the final sentence for several moments. His father had never mentioned lending money to anyone. The second envelope contained another letter from a different family. Its message was remarkably similar. They thanked Samuel for believing in them when every bank had turned them away. They promised to repay what they had received as soon as they were able. The third envelope carried nearly the same tone. Different names, different handwriting, the same gratitude. Harold slowly laid the three letters side by side across the table. None of them mentioned exact amounts. None explained where the money had come from. Yet together they revealed something he had never known. During the years Harold remembered as ordinary seasons of hard work, his father had quietly been helping neighbors survive. He leaned back in his chair, overcome by conflicting emotions. Growing up, he had often believed Samuel Bennett was simply a reserved farmer who kept to himself. Now those memories seemed incomplete. How many other stories had remained hidden? That afternoon, Harold drove back to Walter Dawson's farm carrying the letters. Walter invited him into the kitchen before Harold spread the pages across the table. The old man read each one carefully without surprise. "You knew," Harold said softly. Walter nodded. "Some of it." "Why didn't anyone ever tell me?" Walter folded the letters neatly before answering. "Your father wasn't interested in being praised. He believed if someone accepted help, their dignity mattered more than his reputation." Harold looked down at the faded ink. Where did he get enough money to help all these people? We never had much ourselves. Walter smiled sadly. Sam and your mother lived simpler than most folks realized. He saved every spare dollar he could. But why hide all this? Walter rested both hands on the table because the people he helped weren't looking for charity. They were looking for another chance. Harold thought about his own visit to the bank only days earlier. He understood better than ever how difficult it was to ask for help. Did they ever repay him? He asked. Walter shrugged gently. Some probably did. Some may never have been able to. Your father never kept score in conversations with me. Harold returned home before sunset with even greater respect for the man he thought he had known his entire life. After feeding Rusty, he remembered the small brass key still lying inside the tin box. Until now, he had paid little attention to it. He carried it upstairs to his parents' bedroom and looked around carefully. The old furniture remained exactly as it had for years. A dresser stood beneath the window, while a tall wooden wardrobe occupied the opposite wall. Nothing appeared to match the key. Then his eye settled on a weathered writing desk tucked into the corner of the room. It had belonged to his father, though Harold could not remember anyone opening its center drawer in years. He knelt beside the desk and examined the small lock beneath the handle. The brass key looked almost identical in size. His heartbeat quickened as he slipped it into the lock. It turned smoothly with a quiet click. Harold slowly pulled the drawer open. Inside lay several blank notebooks, an old fountain pen, and beneath a false wooden bottom, the edge of something hidden. Harold lifted the false wooden bottom with the tip of his pocket knife, careful not to splinter the old desk. Beneath it lay a thick ledger bound in cracked brown leather. Dust clung to its edges, and when he opened the cover, the faint smell of paper and time rose into the quiet room. On the first page, written in Samuel Bennett's firm handwriting, were 3 words: Farm Relief Record. Harold sat back on his heels. The title alone made the letters downstairs feel heavier. He carried the ledger to the kitchen, where the afternoon light was stronger, and placed it beside the 3 letters and the faded passbook. Rusty rested beneath the table as Harold began turning the pages. The ledger was not filled with stories. It was filled with names. Each line listed a family, a date, a dollar amount, and a brief note written in Samuel's careful hand. Miller family, seed corn, April 1978. Dawson Farm, hay and feed. June 1978. Carter property, tax payment extension. August 1978. Dozens of entries followed. Some names Harold recognized from old church gatherings and town picnics. Others belonged to families who had long since moved away or passed on. Besides several entries were smaller notes, repaid in full. Partial return. Ask to help next family when able. Harold read until his eyes blurred. His father had not merely helped 1 or 2 neighbors. He had kept an entire circle of struggling farms from collapsing. Harold ran one hand over his face, thinking of all the times Samuel had come home late and said only that someone needed help with equipment or fencing. As a boy, Harold had believed those were ordinary favors between farmers. Now he understood that his father had carried burdens no one else saw. The next morning, Harold returned to the bank with the ledger wrapped in a clean towel. Emily looked surprised, but welcomed him into her office. "I found something else," he said. He placed the book on her desk and opened to the first page. Emily read silently. Her expression softened as she turned several pages. "These are records," she said. "Not official bank records, but very detailed. My father kept them hidden in his desk." Emily glanced toward Thomas Green's office, then back to Harold. "May I make copies of a few pages? It might help Mr. Green compare them with the account history." Harold hesitated only briefly. "As long as the book stays with me." "Of course." While the copier worked, Emily asked about the names listed in the ledger. Harold explained what Walter had told him about the drought years and the families who had promised to repay what they could. Emily listened without the formality she had shown during the loan application. "My grandmother used to talk about a hard season when her parents nearly lost everything," she said quietly. "I never knew details." Harold pointed to one entry. "There was a Carter family here." Emily looked down. The name on the page made her face still. "That might be my family." Neither of them spoke for a moment. The discovery did not prove anything by itself, but it changed the space between them. Emily was no longer only the loan officer who had rejected him. She was someone whose own history might be tied to the hidden account. That afternoon, after closing time, Emily called Harold and asked if she could stop by the farmhouse to review the ledger more carefully. She arrived carrying copies of old bank forms Thomas had allowed her to examine. Together at Harold's kitchen table, they compared dates, deposits, and handwritten notes. Several deposits in the passbook matched amounts marked as repaid in Samuel's ledger. Others were close, but not exact. One repeated phrase appeared beside multiple entries held for the Farm Relief Fund. Emily underlined it lightly on a copy. "This sounds like more than personal lending," she said. Harold looked at the words. "My father never told me he had a fund." "Maybe he didn't think of it that way at first." Emily turned another page. Near the back of the ledger, the handwriting changed slightly, becoming smaller and tighter. as if Samuel had written during a difficult time. There were fewer names, fewer notes, and then one page ended abruptly. Harold turned to continue reading, but the next page was missing. A torn strip remained near the binding. Emily leaned closer. Was it already like that? Harold nodded slowly, touching the ragged edge. I didn't tear it. On the page before the missing one, Samuel had written a final, unfinished line. If anything happens before I can explain this, the promise must be carried out according to the last page. Harold stared at the torn paper, his chest tightening. Whatever his father had wanted most was gone. The torn strip in Samuel Bennett's ledger bothered Harold more than he wanted to admit. For 2 days he searched the old desk, the bedroom drawers, and every box in his parents' closet, hoping the missing page had simply slipped loose and been tucked away somewhere safe. He found tax receipts, seed catalogs, and brittle family photographs, but nothing that completed his father's final instruction. Emily called each afternoon to say Thomas was still checking the bank's historical records. Yet no answer came from that direction either. Finally, Harold did the only thing left. He began visiting the families named in the ledger. Some farms no longer belonged to the people Samuel had helped. A few houses had been sold, divided, or left empty. But Harold knew enough old neighbors to follow the trail. Walter Dawson gave him 3 names to start with, and Harold spent the morning driving dusty county roads with the ledger wrapped on the passenger seat. The first stop was the Miller place, now owned by a grandson named Paul, who remembered Samuel only from childhood. Paul invited Harold into a kitchen that smelled of coffee and wood smoke. When Harold showed him the ledger entry, Paul's face grew quiet. My grandfather said your dad saved us, he admitted, but he never gave details. He just said when things got better, we were supposed to help somebody else. Harold heard that same idea at the next farm, and again at the one after that. Each person knew only a piece. One woman said Samuel had arrived with seed corn when her parents had nothing left to plant. Another remembered a tax bill paid at the last possible moment. An old widower pulled a thank you note from a Bible and let Harold read it with trembling hands. None of them had known the full size of what Samuel had done. By late afternoon, Harold returned home tired and emotionally worn. Grace's car was waiting beside the porch. She stood near the kitchen table when he entered, looking at the open ledger, copied bank pages, and old letters spread across the surface. "Dad," she said carefully, "what is all this?" Harold removed his cap and set it beside the passbook. "Something your grandfather left behind." Grace read a few lines from the ledger. Her expression shifted from concern to confusion. "These are payments to other farms." "Looks that way." "Why didn't you tell me?" Harold sighed. "Because I barely understand it myself." Grace sat across from him. The old argument about selling land hovered between them, but neither reached for it immediately. Harold told her about the hidden box, the bank's reaction, Walter's warning, and the missing page. Grace listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked toward the darkening fields outside. "I thought you were holding on to this place because you were stubborn," she said softly. Harold gave a tired smile. "I probably am." Maybe not only that. Her words stayed with him. For the first time in months, she was not asking him to let go. She was trying to understand why he could not. The following morning, Grace drove with him to visit one more name from the ledger, a woman Walter had mentioned named Mrs. Ellen Price. She was 90 years old and lived in a small white house near the edge of town. Her daughter welcomed them in, and Ellen recognized Harold the moment she heard Samuel Bennett's name. "Sam kept my brothers from leaving the farm," she said. her voice thin but steady. Harold opened the ledger to her family's entry. Ellen touched the page gently. "He wrote everything down. That sounds like him." Grace leaned forward. "Do you know anything about a missing page?" Ellen's eyes narrowed in thought. For a moment, Harold expected another disappointment. Then she asked her daughter to bring a 10 recipe box from the pantry. Inside, between old index cards and newspaper clippings, was a folded sheet of yellowed paper. "Your father gave my husband a copy," Ellen said. "He said someone besides him ought to have one, in case the original was ever lost." Harold's hands shook as she passed it to him. The handwriting was Samuel's. At the top of the page, underlined twice, were the words, "Original Promise." Harold accepted the yellowed sheet with both hands, afraid it might crumble if he gripped it too tightly. Samuel Bennett's handwriting was unmistakable. Every letter carried the same careful precision Harold had seen in the ledger. Ellen Price smiled faintly. "Your father asked my husband to keep that copy somewhere safe. He said no one should ever need it. But if they did, they'd know what to do." Harold thanked her quietly before he and Grace returned to the farmhouse. Neither spoke much during the drive. The folded page rested on the dashboard between them, carrying more weight than a stack of legal papers. Back home, Harold spread the document beside the ledger and the letters on the kitchen table. Emily arrived shortly afterward, responding to Harold's call without hesitation. The three of them stood together as Harold carefully unfolded the page. Across the top, beneath the title Original Promise, Samuel had written only a few paragraphs. They were simple, direct, and deeply personal. If the money ever returned, it was never to become private wealth. Every dollar that came back was to remain available for another farming family facing disaster. No family receiving help should ever feel ashamed. If they recovered, they were asked only to help the next family when they could. If they never recovered, the debt was to end with kindness, not hardship. Harold stopped reading for a moment, his voice catching. The room fell silent. Grace looked toward the fields outside the window. "Grandpa wasn't trying to build a business," she whispered. "He was trying to keep people on their land." Harold nodded slowly. For the first time since finding the hidden compartment, he felt he understood the man who had raised him. Samuel had never spoken about sacrifice because he had never wanted gratitude. Emily read the page again, tracing one sentence with her finger. "This explains the repeated note in the ledger," she said. "Held for the Farm Relief Fund. Your father wasn't collecting repayments for himself." Harold looked at the passbook. He was protecting the money so it could keep helping others. Emily smiled gently. "Exactly." That afternoon, Harold drove to the bank carrying the copied promise, the ledger, and the passbook. Thomas Green welcomed him into his office immediately. The manager read Samuel's statement without interruption, then carefully compared it with several historical documents spread across his desk. "This answers several questions," Thomas said quietly. "The language matches notes we've located in our archived files." Harold leaned forward. "So my father really created this?" Thomas nodded cautiously. "It certainly appears he established an organized fund, even if it was never publicly described that way." Emily remained beside the filing cabinet, listening as Thomas continued examining old records. The manager entered several authorization codes into the computer, then opened another archived banking screen. Minutes passed in complete silence, except for the sound of keys clicking. Finally, Thomas stopped typing. He stared at the monitor, adjusted his glasses, and read the information again. "I wanted to be absolutely certain before saying this," he said. Harold's heart began beating faster. Certain about what? Thomas turned the screen slightly. Though the figures remained too far away to read clearly, the account has remained active for all these years. Harold nodded. You told me that before. Yes, Thomas replied. But today I confirmed something else. Emily looked toward him expectantly. Thomas folded his hands on the desk. The account has never been idle. Harold frowned. I don't understand. Deposits continued for years after the original ones listed in your father's passbook. Harold glanced at the ledger. From the families who repaid him, some appear to match those records, Thomas answered. Others came later. The money remained invested exactly as the account instructions required. Harold struggled to absorb the information. His father had died believing the promise would continue. And somehow, it had. Thomas reached into a folder and removed one final document confirming the account's current status. He looked directly at Harold before speaking. Mr. Bennett, he said quietly. After decades of careful management and accumulated interest, the balance has grown far beyond what anyone here expected. Harold stared at Thomas Green across the desk, unsure whether he had heard him correctly. The bank manager had not given him a number yet, only the careful warning that the balance had grown far beyond what anyone expected. But even that was enough to make the room feel smaller. Emily stood near the filing cabinet with Samuel Bennett's copied promise in her hand, watching Harold with quiet concern. How far beyond? Harold asked. Thomas glanced at the documents again. Before I discuss exact figures, the bank has to complete formal verification. We need to confirm ownership instructions, historical account conditions, and whether the fund was legally tied to your father's original purpose. Harold let out a slow breath. So even now, it still isn't simple. No, Thomas admitted. But it is real. Those 4 words stayed with Harold as he left the bank. The account was real. The promise was real. The quiet sacrifices his father had made were real. Yet the irrigation pump at home was still broken. The planting season was still approaching. And Harold still did not know whether any of this would save his farm. Over the next several days, the bank asked for copies of everything. The passbook, the ledger, the letters, and the page Ellen Price had kept safe for decades. Harold refused to let the originals leave his hands, but he allowed Emily to scan each item while he sat beside her. She treated the papers gently, as if they belonged not only to him, but to the whole town. I found something else in the archived records, she told him one afternoon. There were small deposits made every few years under different family names. Some matched the ledger. Some came much later. Harold looked at the screen. People remembered. Emily nodded. Maybe not everyone, but enough. Thomas spent hours comparing the old handwritten records with bank archives. He spoke with regional compliance officers, requested file boxes from storage, and reviewed account rules that had not been used in decades. Each new confirmation seemed to make him more cautious, not less. Meanwhile, word began to spread. At first, it was only a few older neighbors calling Harold to ask whether it was true that Samuel Bennett had kept families from losing their land during the drought years. Then a short article appeared in the local paper under a simple headline about forgotten farm records. Harold hated seeing his father's name in print at first. Samuel had never wanted attention, but the article did not make him sound like a hero. It made him sound like what he had been, a farmer who helped quietly when others had nowhere to turn. By the end of the week, people began stopping by the farmhouse. Paul Miller brought an old photograph of his grandfather standing beside Samuel near a hay wagon. Ellen Price's daughter delivered a copy of a family letter thanking Samuel for seed money. A retired teacher left a note saying her parents had kept their farm because someone had paid the tax bill in 1978, and now she finally knew who it had been. Grace came over one evening and found Harold sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by memories that had never belonged to him before. "You look overwhelmed," she said. Harold gave a faint smile. "I spent my whole life thinking my father was a quiet man." Grace picked up one of the photographs. Maybe he was. Maybe quiet people can still change everything. Harold looked at her, surprised by the softness in her voice. The old tension between them had not vanished, but something had shifted. She no longer spoke of selling land as the only practical answer. She looked at the farm now as if it held a story she had only begun to understand. 2 days later, Thomas called Harold back to the bank. Emily was already in the office when he arrived. A thick folder rested on Thomas's desk, marked with Samuel Bennett's name and the old account number. Thomas explained that the records had been verified as far as the bank could verify them internally. The account had remained active, had accumulated interest, and had been protected by instructions connected to the original farm relief purpose. The exact legal handling would still require formal review, but the evidence was strong enough that the bank had contacted the town office for historical confirmation. Harold frowned. "The town office?" Thomas nodded. "Some of the early records refer to emergency farm assistance during the drought, but your father's name does not appear where it should." Emily looked down at the copied promise. "That's part of what needs to be corrected." Harold felt a strange unease. He had wanted only $5,000 to fix a pump. Now strangers were searching through town history because of a box hidden behind a clock. That afternoon, the local newspaper published a longer story. By evening, 2 neighboring farmers had called to say they remembered hearing their parents mention Samuel. The next morning, a letter arrived from the mayor's office. Harold opened it at the kitchen table while Rusty lay at his feet. Mayor Susan Hill requested his presence at a special town meeting regarding recently discovered records connected to Samuel Bennett and the old farm relief account. Harold read the letter twice, then looked toward the fields beyond the window. The account had been hidden for more than 40 years. Now the whole town wanted to know what it meant. Harold arrived at the town hall carrying the worn passbook, Samuel Bennett's ledger, the copied promise, and the 3 letters that had started everything. Grace walked beside him, while Emily met them at the entrance after finishing her morning at the bank. Thomas Green was already inside with several folders of archived banking records. The meeting had been scheduled by Mayor Susan Hill, but it quickly became clear that much of the audience consisted of neighbors whose families had lived in the county for generations. Some Harold recognized from church. Others he knew only by face. The mayor welcomed everyone, then thanked Harold for allowing the town to examine the documents discovered in his parents' farmhouse. "What began as a routine records review," she said, "has become an opportunity to correct an important part of our community's history." She invited Thomas to summarize the bank's findings. Thomas spoke carefully, explaining that Samuel Bennett's account had remained active since the late 1970s, that deposits continued over many years, and that every available record supported the purpose described in Samuel's handwritten promise. The account had never been abandoned. It had simply been forgotten by everyone who understood why it existed. Emily then displayed copies of the ledger entries beside matching bank deposits. The names, dates, and repayments lined up with remarkable consistency. Quiet murmurs spread through the room as people recognized family names. Several older residents nodded to one another. One elderly man slowly stood. "My father told me there was someone who helped us after the drought," he said. "He never wanted us to say who, because that man wouldn't have liked the attention. Another woman wiped away tears before speaking. My parents kept their farm because someone paid what they couldn't. We never knew who. One by one, similar memories surfaced. None of the stories sounded rehearsed. Each revealed only one small piece. Yet together, they painted the same picture. Samuel Bennett had quietly become the person desperate families turned to when every official source had failed them. Mayor Hill opened a thin archival file recovered from the town records office. For many years, she said, our local history credited the County Agricultural Committee with organizing emergency support after the drought. Those records were incomplete. She held up several newly compared documents. The evidence now shows that the original financial support came from Samuel Bennett's privately organized Farm Relief Fund. The committee later expanded those efforts, but the initial work belonged to one man. Harold lowered his eyes. He imagined his father standing in worn work boots, never expecting anyone to remember. The room fell silent for several seconds before applause slowly filled the hall. It was not loud or theatrical. It sounded like gratitude delayed for 40 years. After the meeting ended, many people approached Harold. Some thanked him. Others thanked his father through him. A few simply shook his hand without speaking. Grace watched quietly beside him. I wish Grandpa could have seen this, she whispered. Harold smiled sadly. He probably would have slipped out the back door before anyone finished clapping. Grace laughed softly through moist eyes. Outside the hall, Emily found Harold standing alone near the courthouse steps. Mr. Bennett, she said, I've wanted to tell you something. Harold turned toward her. Emily took a slow breath. The day you came asking for a $5,000 loan, I saw only numbers on a page. I followed the rules, and I don't regret doing my job honestly. But I am sorry I never understood the man sitting across from me. Harold offered a gentle smile. Neither did I. Emily, not completely. She looked relieved. Thank you. Before leaving, Thomas joined them carrying one final folder. The historical questions have been answered, he said. The account itself is now entering its final legal review. Harold nodded. I appreciate everything you've done. Thomas hesitated before continuing. There is still one decision that only you can make. Harold understood immediately. The account, the accumulated funds, and Samuel's written promise now rested in his hands. The town had recognized his father's work. The bank had confirmed the account's purpose. The history had finally been corrected. But no document could decide what happened next. As Harold drove home that evening, the sun settled behind the fields his family had worked for generations. Rusty rested quietly on the passenger seat, while the passbook and Samuel's promise lay safely inside the worn envelope beside him. For the first time since the bank had refused his loan, Harold no longer wondered whether his father had left him enough money. He wondered whether he had the courage to honor the life his father had quietly built. Harold did not sleep much the night after the town meeting. The farmhouse was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and Rusty's slow breathing near the back door. On the kitchen table lay everything that had changed his life in less than 2 weeks. The passbook, the ledger, the copied promise, the old letters, and Thomas Green's final folder. For days, people had spoken of balances, records, ownership, and legal review. But when Harold looked at Samuel Bennett's handwriting, the matter seemed simpler and harder at the same time. If the money ever returned, it was never to become private wealth. Harold read that line until morning light touched the window. By noon, He was back at First County Bank. Grace came with him, not to argue or persuade, but to sit beside him. Emily and Thomas were waiting in the same office where Harold had first learned the account still existed. Thomas explained that the final review supported Samuel's written purpose. Harold, as Samuel Bennett's surviving heir, had authority to help restore the fund under proper modern terms. A portion could legally be used to preserve the Bennett farm because the original promise existed to keep farming families from losing their land. The rest could remain protected for future farmers. Harold listened quietly, then placed his hand on the old passbook. "Then that's what we'll do," he said. "Fix the pump, keep the farm working, and put the rest back where my father wanted it." Grace looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Dad, are you sure?" Harold nodded. "I needed $5,000. My father left something worth more than money. I won't be the man who turns it into only money." Emily lowered her eyes for a moment, moved beyond words. Thomas drew up the first documents for the restored Samuel Bennett Farm Relief Fund, with clear rules that protected dignity as much as dollars. Families facing drought, disaster, equipment failure, or sudden hardship could apply privately. Repayment would be encouraged only when recovery allowed it. No one would be shamed for needing help. No one would be crushed for failing to recover fast enough. Emily was asked to help administer the new agricultural lending and relief program because she knew both the bank's rules and the human cost behind them. She accepted quietly, then looked at Harold. "I'll do better this time," she said. Harold smiled. "You already are." The repair crew came to the farm 3 days later. Harold stood near the field while 2 men replaced the failed irrigation pump and checked the old water lines. Rusty sat proudly beside him as if supervising the work. When the pump finally started, water surged through the system and sprayed across the dry rows in bright silver arcs. Harold removed his cap and let the mist touch his face. It was only water, but for the first time in months, it felt like mercy. Grace arrived that afternoon carrying sandwiches and a box of old photographs she had found in storage. She watched the sprinklers turn across the field before speaking. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" Harold asked. "About the farm. About Grandpa. About you." She took a nervous breath. "I don't want you handling all this alone anymore. I can't promise I know everything about farming, but I want to learn. Maybe not all at once, but I want to come back more often. Help with the books. Maybe help plan what comes next." Harold looked at his daughter, hearing the words he had never dared ask for. "Your mother would like that," he said softly. Grace smiled through tears. "So would Grandpa, I think." Weeks passed, and the story of Samuel Bennett settled into the town not as gossip, but as memory returned to its rightful place. Mayor Susan Hill organized a small ceremony at the edge of the Bennett farm, near the road where neighbors had passed for generations without knowing what had begun there. The town did not build a grand statue. Harold would not have allowed it. Instead, they placed a simple stone marker beneath an oak tree Samuel had planted decades earlier. Its inscription read, "Samuel Bennett, farmer and neighbor, founder of the Farm Relief Promise, 1978. On the day of the dedication, families gathered quietly in the grass. Some were descendants of those Samuel had helped. Some were young farmers who might one day need the restored fund. Walter Dawson came with a cane and stood beside Harold, his eyes fixed on the stone. "Sam would be embarrassed," Walter said. Harold smiled. "I know. But he'd be glad it kept going." Harold looked across the field, where Grace was speaking with Emily near the fence line. "Yes," he said. "I think he would." When Mayor Hill invited Harold to say a few words, he stepped forward slowly. Public speaking had never suited him, and for a moment he considered saying nothing at all. Then he looked at the faces before him and thought of his father hiding a box behind a clock, trusting that someday someone might understand. "My father wasn't a rich man," Harold said. "Most years, he had just enough. But I guess he believed enough was something you could share. I spent most of my life thinking inheritance meant land, tools, or money in an account. Now I know it can also mean responsibility. It can mean finishing a promise someone else was too humble to explain." He paused, his voice thickening. "I came to the bank asking for $5,000 because I thought that was what would save my farm. But what saved me was learning that this land was never meant to stand alone. Neither were any of us." No one applauded immediately. The silence that followed felt deeper than applause. Then Walter placed a hand on Harold's shoulder, and the crowd slowly came together around the marker. That evening, after everyone had gone, Harold remained by the fence as the sun lowered over the fields. The repaired irrigation system clicked steadily in the distance. Grace stood beside him, her shoulder touching his. Rusty lay at their feet, tired from greeting half the town. Harold thought about the day Emily had denied his loan and how small he had felt walking out of the bank with nothing. He had believed rejection meant the end of the road. Instead, it had sent him back into the old house, to the clock, to the hidden box, to the truth his father had left waiting. The account had changed everything, but not because of the balance. It changed everything because it revealed who Samuel Bennett had been and who Harold still had time to become. As the first stars appeared, Harold looked over the farm with a peace he had not felt in years. The land was still difficult. The seasons would still test him. There would be repairs, bills, dry spells, and hard mornings. But the farm was alive. The promise was alive. And somewhere in the quiet between the rows, Harold felt his father's legacy moving forward. Not as a secret anymore, but as a hand extended to the next person who needed help standing back up.